St. Thomas Aquinas, Part 6. Chapter 5. The Real Life of St. Thomas. At this point, even so crude and external a sketch of a great saint involves the necessity of writing something that cannot fit in with the rest. The one thing which it is important to write and impossible to write. A saint may be any kind of man, with an additional quality that is at once unique and universal. We might even say that the one thing which separates a saint from the ordinary men is his readiness to be one with ordinary men. In this sense, the word ordinary must be understood in its native and noble meaning, which is connected with the word order. A saint is long past any desire for distinction. He is only sort of a superior man who has never been a superior person. But all this arises from a great central fact, which he does not condescend to call a privilege, but which is in its very nature a sort of privacy, and in that sense almost a form of private property. As with all sound private property, it is enough for him that he has it. He does not desire to limit the number of people who have it. He is always trying to hide it, out of a sort of celestial good manners. And Thomas Aquinas tried to hide it more than most. To reach it, in so far as we can reach it, it will be best to begin with the upper strata, and reach what was in the inside from what was most conspicuous on the outside. The appearance or bodily presence of St. Thomas Aquinas is really easier to resurrect than that of many who lived before the age of portrait painting. It has been said that in his bodily being or bearing there was little of the Italian, but this is at the best, I fancy, an unconscious comparison between St. Thomas and St. Francis, and at worst, only a comparison between him and the hasty legend of the vivacious organ grinders and incendiary ice cream men. Not all Italians are vivacious organ grinders, and very few Italians are like St. Francis. A nation is never a type, but it is nearly always a tangle of the two or three roughly recognizable types. St. Thomas was of a certain type, which is not so much common in Italy as common to uncommon Italians. His bulk made it easy to regard him humorously as a sort of walking wine barrel, common in the comedies of many nations. He joked about it himself. It may be that he, and not some irritated partisan of the Augustinian or Arabian parties, was responsible for the sublime exaggeration that a crescent was cut out of the dinner table to allow him to sit down. It is quite certain that it was an exaggeration, and that his stature was more remarked than his stoutness. But above all, that his head was quite powerful enough to dominate the body, and his head was of a very real and recognizable type, to judge by the traditional portraits and personal descriptions. It was that sort of head with the heavy chin and jaws, the Roman nose, a rather bald brow, which, in spite of its fullness, gives also a curious concave impression that hollows here or there, like caverns of thought. Napoleon carried that head upon a short body. Mussolini carries it today, upon a rather taller but equally active one. It can be seen in the busts of several Roman emperors, and occasionally above the shabby shirt front of an Italian waiter, but he is generally a head waiter. So unmistakable is the type that I cannot but think that the most vivid villain of light fiction in the Victorian shocker called The Woman in White was really sketched by Wilkie Collins from an actual Italian count. He was so complete a contrast to the conventional skinny, swarthy, gesticulating villain whom the Victorians commonly presented as an Italian count. Count Fosco, it may be remembered, I hope, by some, was a calm, corpulent, colossal gentleman whose head was exactly like a bust of Napoleon of heroic size. He may have been a melodramatic villain, but he was tolerably convincing Italian of that kind. If we recall his tranquil manner and the excellent common sense of his everyday external words and actions, we shall probably have a merely material image of the type of a Thomas Aquinas. Only the slight effort of faith required to imagine Count Fosco suddenly turned into a saint. The pictures of St. Thomas, though many of them were painted long after his death, are all obviously pictures of the same man. He rears himself defiantly, with the Napoleonic head and dark bulk of body, and Raphael's dispute about the sacrament. A portrait by Ghirlandajo emphasizes a point which especially reveals what may be called the neglected Italian quality in the man. It also emphasizes points that are very important in the mystic and the philosopher. It is universally attested that Aquinas was what is commonly called an absent-minded man. That type often has been rendered in painting humorous or serious, but almost always in one or two or three conventional ways. Sometimes the expression of the eyes is merely vacant, as if absent-mindedness really meant a permanent absence of mind. Sometimes it is rendered more respectfully as a wistful expression, as of one yearning for something afar off, that he cannot see and can only faintly desire. Look at the eaves in Ghirlandajo's portrait of St. Thomas, and you will see a sharp difference. Why, the eyes are indeed completely torn away from the immediate surroundings, so that the pot of flowers above the philosopher's head might fall on it, without attracting his attention. They are not in the least wistful, let alone vacant. There is kindled in them a fire of instant inner excitement. They are vivid and very Italian eyes. The man is thinking about something, and something that has reached a crisis, not about nothing or about anything, or, what is almost worse, about everything. There must have been that smoldering vigilance in his eyes the moment before he smote the table and startled the banquet hall of the king. Of the personal habits that go with the personal physique, we also have a few convincing and confirming impressions. When he was not sitting still, reading a book, he walked round and round the cloisters, and walked fast and even furiously, a very characteristic action of men who fight their battles in the mind. Whenever he was interrupted, he was very polite and more apologetic than the apologizer. But there was that about him which suggested that he was rather happier when he was not interrupted. He was ready to stop his truly peripatetic tramp, but we feel that when he resumed it, he walked all the faster. All this suggests that his superficial abstraction, that which the world saw, was of a certain kind. It, be, it will be well to understand the quality, for there are several kinds of absence of mind, including that of some pretentious poets and intellectuals, in whom the mind has never been noticeably present. There was the abstraction of the contemplative, whether he is of the true sort of Christian contemplative, who is contemplating something, or the wrong sort of Oriental contemplative, who is contemplating nothing. Obviously, St. Thomas was not a Buddhist mystic, but I do not think his fits of abstraction, even those of a Christian mystic. If he had trances of true Christian mysticism, he took jolly good care that they should not occur at other people's dinner tables. I think he had the sort of bemused fit which really belongs to the practical man rather to an entirely mystical man. He uses the recognized distinction between the active life and the contemplative life. But in the cases concerned here, I think even his contemplative life was an active life. It had nothing to do with his higher life, in the sense of ultimate sanctity. It rather reminds us that Napoleon would fall into a fit of apparent boredom at the opera, and afterwards confess that he was thinking now he could get 3 army corps at Frankfurt to combine with 2 army corps at Cologne. So, in the case of Aquinas, if his daydreams were dreams, they were dreams of the day, and dreams of the day of battle. If he talked to himself, it was because he was arguing with somebody else. We can put it another way by saying that his daydreams, like the dreams of a dog, were dreams of hunting, of pursuing the error as well as pursuing the truth, of following all the twists and turns of evasive falsehood and tracking it at last to its lair in hell. He would have been first to admit that the erroneous thinker would probably be more surprised to learn where his thought came from than anybody else to discover where it went to. But this notion of pursuing he had certainly had, and it was the beginning of 1,000 mistakes and misunderstanding in pursuing what it is called in Latin persecution. Nobody had less than he had of what is commonly called the temper of a persecutor. But he had the quality in which desperate times is often driven to persecute, and that is simply the sense that everything lives somewhere, and nothing dies unless it dies in its own home. That he did sometimes, in this sense, urge in dreams the shadowy chase even in broad daylight, is quite true. But he was an active dreamer, if not what is commonly called a man of action, and in that chase he was truly to be counted among domani canis, surely in the mightiness and the most magnanimous of the hounds of heaven. There may be many who do not understand the nature even of this sort of abstraction. But then, unfortunately, there are many who do not understand the nature of any sort of argument. Indeed, I think there are fewer people now alive who understand argument than there were 20 or 30 years ago. And St. Thomas might have preferred the society of atheists of the early 19th century to that of the blank skeptics of the early 20th. Anyhow, one of the real disadvantages of the great and glorious sport that is called argument is its inordinate length. If you argue honestly, as St. Thomas always did, you will find that the subject sometimes seems as if it would never end. He was strongly conscious of this fact, as appears in many places. For instance, his argument that most men must have a revealed religion because they have not time to argue. No time, that is, to argue fairly. But there is always time to argue unfairly, not least in a time like ours. Being himself resolved to argue honestly, to answer everybody, to deal with everything, he produced books enough to sink a ship or stock a library, though he died in comparative early middle age. Perhaps he could not have done it all, if he had not been thinking even when he was not writing, but above all thinking combatively. This, in his case, certainly did not mean bitterly or spitefully or uncharitably, but it did mean combatively. As a matter of fact, it is generally the man who is not ready to argue who is ready to sneer. That is why, in recent literature, there has been so little argument and so much sneering. We have noted that there are barely one or two occasions in which St. Thomas indulged in a denunciation. There is not a single occasion on which he indulged in a sneer. His curiously simple character, his lucid but laborious intellect, could not be better summed up than by saying he did not know how to sneer. He was in a double sense an intellectual aristocrat, but he was never an intellectual snob. He never troubled at all whether those to whom he talked were more or less of the sort whom the world thinks worth talking to. It was apparent by the impression of his contemporaries that those who received the ordinary scraps of his wit or wisdom were quite as likely to be nobodies as somebodies, or even quite as likely to be noodles as clever people. He was interested in the souls of all his fellow creatures, but not in classifying the minds of any of them. In a sense it was too personal, and in another sense too arrogant for his particular mind and temper. He was very much interested in the subject he was talking about, and may sometimes have talked for a long time, though he was probably silent for a much longer time. But he had all the unconscious contempt which the really intelligent have for an intelligentsia. Like most men concerned with the common problems of men, he seems to have had a considerable correspondence, considering that correspondence was so much more difficult in his time. We have records of a great many cases in which complete strangers wrote to ask him questions, and sometimes rather ridiculous questions. To all of these he replied with a characteristic mixture of patience and that sort of rationality which in some rational people tends to be impatience. Somebody, for instance, asked him whether the names of all the blessed were written on a scroll exhibited in heaven. He wrote back with untiring calm, "So far as I can see, this is not the case, but there is no harm in saying so." I have remarked on the portrait of St. Thomas by an Italian painter, which shows him alert even in abstraction, the only silent as if about to speak. The pictures in that great tradition are generally full of small touches that show a very large imagination. I mean the sort of imagination on which Ruskin remarked, when he saw that in Tintoretto's sunlit scene of the crucifixion, the face of Christ is dark and undecipherable, but the halo round his head unexpectedly faint and gray like the color of ashes. It would be hard to put more powerfully the idea of divinity itself in eclipse. There is a touch, which it may be fanciful and find equally significant, in the portrait of Thomas Aquinas. The artist, having given so much vividness and vigilance to the eyes, may have felt that he stressed too much the merely combative concentration of the saint. But anyhow, for some reason he was emblazoned upon his breast a rather curious emblem, as if it were some third symbolic encyclopedian eye. At least, it is no normal Christian sign, but something more like a disk of the sun, such as held the face of a heathen god. But the face itself is dark and occult, and only the rays breaking from it are a ring of fire. I do not know whether any traditional meaning has been attached to this, but its imaginative meaning is strangely apt. That secret sun, dark with excess of light, or not showing its light save the enlightenment of others, might well be an exact emblem of that inner and ideal life of the saint, which was not only hidden by his external words and actions, but even hidden from his merely outward and automatic silences and fits of reflection. In short, this spiritual detachment is not to be confused with his common habit of brooding or falling into a brown study. He was a man entirely careless of all casual criticism of his casual demeanor. As are many men built on a big masculine model and unconsciously inheriting a certain social splendor and largesse. But about his real life of sanctity he was intensely secretive. Such secrecy has indeed generally gone with sanctity, for the saint has an unfathomable horror of playing the Pharisee. But in Thomas Aquinas it was even more sensitive, and what many in the world would call morbid. He did not mind being caught wool-gathering over the wine-cups of the king's banquet, for that was merely a point upon controversy. But when there was some question of his having seen St. Paul in a vision, he was in an agony of alarm lest it should be discussed, and the story remained somewhat uncertain in consequence. Needless to say, his followers and admirers were as eager to collect these strictly miraculous stories as he was eager to conceal them, and one or two seem to be preserved with a fairly solid setting of evidence. But there are certainly fewer of them known to the world, and in the case of many saints equally sincere and even equally modest, but more preoccupied with zeal and less sensitivity about publicity. The truth is that about all such things, in life and death, there is a sort of enormous quiet hanging about St. Thomas. He was one of those large things who take up little room. There was naturally a certain stir about his miracles after his death, and about his burial at the time when the University of Paris wished to bury him. I do not know in detail the long history of the other plans of sepulture, which have ultimately ended with his sacred bones lying in the church of St. Sernin in Toulouse, at the very base of the battlefields where his Dominicans had warred down the pestilence of pessimism from the east. But somehow it is not easy to think of his shrine as the scene of the more jolly, rowdy, and vulgar devotion, either in its medieval or modern form. He was very far from being a Puritan, in the true sense. he made a provision for a holiday and banquet for his young friends, which was quite a convivial sound. The trend of his writing, especially for his time, is reasonable in its recognition of physical life, and he even goes out of his way to say that men must vary their lives with jokes and even with pranks. But for all that, we cannot somehow see his personality as a sort of magnet for mobs, or the road to the tomb of St. Thomas at Toulouse having always been a long street of taverns, like that to the tomb of St. Thomas at Canterbury. I think he rather disliked noise. There is a legend that he disliked thunderstorms, but it is contradicted by the fact that in an actual shipwreck he was supremely calm. However that may be, it was probably concerning his health. In some way sensitive, he certainly was very calm. We have a feeling that we should gradually grow conscious of his presence, as of an immense background. Here, if this slight sketch could be worthy of its subject, there should stand forth something of that stupendous certitude, in the presence of which all his libraries of philosophy, and even theology, were but a litter of pamphlets. It is certain that this thing was in him from the first, in the form of conviction long before it could have possibly even begun to take the form of controversy. It was very vivid in his childhood, and his were exactly the circumstances in which the anecdotes of nursery and the playground are likely enough to have been really preserved. He had from the first that full and final test of truly orthodox Catholicity, the impetuous, impatient, intolerant passion for the poor, and even that readiness to be rather a nuisance to the rich out of a hunger to feed the hungry. This can have nothing to do with the intellectualism of which he was afterwards accused, still less with any habit of dialectic. It would seem unlikely that at the age of 6 he had any ambition to answer Everhose, or that he knew what effective causality is, or even that he had worked out, as he did in later life, the whole theory by which a man's love of himself is sincere and constant and indulgent, and that this should be transferred intact, if possible, to his love of his neighbor. At this early age he did not understand all this. He only did it. But all the atmosphere of his actions carried a sort of conviction with it. It is beautifully typical, for instance, of that sort of aristocratic menage, that his parents seem to have objected mildly, if at all, to his handing out things to beggars and tramps, but it was intensely disliked by the upper servants. Still, if we take the thing as seriously as all childish things should be taken, we may learn something from that mysterious state of innocence, which is the first and best spring of all our later indignations. We may begin to understand why it was that there grew steadily with his growing mind a great and solitary mind, an ambition that was the inversion of all the things about him. We shall guess what had continuously swelled within him, whether in protest or prophecy or prayer for deliverance, before he startled his family by flinging away not only the trappings of nobility, but all forms of ambition, even ecclesiastical ambition. His childhood may contain the hint of that first stride of his manhood, from the house onto the highway, and his proclamation that he would also be a beggar. There is another case of a sort of second glimpse, or sequel, in which an incident well known in the external sense gives us a glimpse of the internal. After the affair of the firebrand and the woman who tempted him in the tower, it is said that he had a dream, in which two angels girded him with a cord of fire, a thing of terrible pain and yet giving a terrible strength. And he awoke with a great cry in the darkness. This is also has something very vivid about it, under the circumstances, and probably contains truths that will some day better understood. When priests and doctors have learned to talk to each other without the stale etiquette of 19th century negations, it would be easy to analyze the dream, as the very 19th century doctor did in Armadale, resolving it into the details of the past days, the cord from his struggle against being stripped of his friar's frock, the thread of fire running through the tapestries of the night, from the firebrand he had snatched from the fireside. But even in Armadale, the dream was fulfilled mystically as well, and the dream of St. Thomas was fulfilled very mystically indeed. For he did, in fact, remain remarkably untroubled on that side of his human nature after the incident, though it is likely enough that the incident had caused an upheaval of his normal humanity, which produced a dream stronger than a nightmare. This is no place to analyze the psychological fact, which puzzles non-Catholics so much, of the way in which priests do manage to be celibate without ceasing to be virile. Anyhow, it seems probable that in this matter he was less troubled than most. This has nothing to do with true virtue, which is of the will. Saints as holy as he have rolled themselves in brambles to distract the pressure of passion. But he never needed much in the way of a counter-irritant, for the simple reason that in this way, as in most ways, he was not very often irritated. Much must remain unexplained, as part of the mysteries of grace, but there is probably some truth in the psychological idea of sublimation, that is, the lifting of a lower energy to higher ends, so that appetite almost faded in the furnace of his intellectual energy. Between supernatural and natural causes, it is probable that he never knew or suffered greatly on this side of his mind. There are moments when the most orthodox reader is tempted to hate the hagiographer as much as he loves the holy man. The holy man always conceals his holiness. That is the one invariable rule. And the hagiographer sometimes seems like a persecutor trying to frustrate the holy man, a spy or eavesdropper hardly more respectful than an American interviewer. I admit that these sentiments are fastidious and one-sided, and I will now proceed to prove my penitence by mentioning one or two of the incidents that could only have come to common knowledge in this deplorable way. It seems certain that he did live a sort of secondary and mysterious life, the divine double of what is called a double life. Somebody seems to have caught a glimpse of the sort of solitary miracle which modern psychic people call levitation. He must surely have either been a liar or a literal witness, for there could have been no doubts or degrees about such a prodigy happening to such a person. It must have been like seeing one of the huge pillars of the church suspended like a cloud. Nobody knows, I imagine, What spiritual storm of exaltation or agony produces this convulsion in matter or space? But the thing almost does certainly occur. Even in the case of ordinary spiritualist mediums, for whatever reason, the evidence is very difficult to refute. But probably the most representative revelation of this side of his life may be found in the celebrated story of the miracle of the crucifix, when in the stillness of the church of St. Dominic in Naples, a voice spoke from the carven Christ, and told the kneeling friar that he had written rightly, and offered him the choice of a reward among all the things of the world. Not all, I think, have appreciated the point of this particular story as applied to this particular saint. It is an old story, insofar as it is simply the offer made to a devotee of solitude and simplicity, of the pick of all the prizes of life. The hermit, true or false, the fakir, the fanatic, or the cynic, Stylites on his column, or Diogenes in his tub, can all be pictured as tempted by the powers of the earth, of the air, or of the heavens, with the offer of the best of everything, and replying that they want nothing. In the Greek cynic or stoic, it really meant the mere negative, that he wanted nothing. In the Oriental mystic or fanatic, it is something meant a sort of positive negative, that he wanted nothing, that nothing was really what he wanted. Sometimes it expressed a noble independence, and the twin virtues of antiquity, the love of liberty and the hatred of luxury. Sometimes it only expressed a self-sufficiency that is the very opposite of sanctity. But even the stories of real saints of this sort do not quite cover the case of St. Thomas. He was not a person who wanted nothing, and he was a person who was enormously interested in everything. His answer is not so inevitable or simple as some may suppose. As compared with many other saints and many other philosophers, he was avid in his acceptance of things, in his hunger and thirst for things. It was his special spiritual thesis that there really are things, and not only the thing, that the many existed as well as the one. I do not mean things to eat or drink or wear, though he never denied to these their place in the noble hierarchy of being, but rather things to think about, especially things to prove, to experience and to know. Nobody supposes that Thomas Aquinas, when offered by God his choice among the gifts of gods, would ask for £1,000, or the crown of Sicily, or a present of Greek rare wine. But he might have asked for things that he really wanted, and he was a man who could want things, as he wanted the lost manuscript of St. Chesterton. He might have asked for the solution of an old difficulty, or the secret of a new science, or a flash of the inconceivable intuitive mind of the angels, or any one of 1,000 things that would really have satisfied his broad and virile appetite for the very vastness and variety of the universe. The point is that for him, when the voice spoke from between the outstretched arms of the crucified, those arms were truly opened wide, and opening most gloriously the gates of all the world. They were arms pointing to the east and to the west, to the ends of the earth and the very extremes of existence. They were truly spread out with a gesture of omnipotent generosity, the Creator himself offering creation itself, with all its millionfold mystery of separate beings, and the triumphal chorus of the creatures. That is the blazing background of the multitudinous being that gives the particular strength, and even a sort of surprise to the answer of St. Thomas, when he lifted at last his head and spoke, with and for that most blasphemous audacity which is one with the humility of his religion, I will have thyself. Or, to add the crowning and crushing irony of this to the story, so uniquely Christian for those who can really understand it, there are some who feel that the audacity is softened by insisting that he said, only thyself. Of these miracles, in the strictly miraculous sense, there are not so many as in the lives of immediately influential saints, but they are probably pretty well authenticated, for he was a well-known public man in a prominent position, and what is even more convenient for him, he had any number of highly incensed enemies, who could be trusted to sift his claims. There is at least one miracle of healing, that of a woman who touched his gown, and several incidents that may be variants of the story of the crucifix at Naples. One of these stories, however, has a further importance as bringing us to another session of his more private, personal, or even emotional religious life, the section that expressed itself in poetry. When he was stationed at Paris, the other doctors of the Sorbonne put before him a problem about the nature of the mystical change in the elements of the Blessed Sacrament, and he proceeded to write, in his customary manner, a very careful and elaborately lucid statement of his own solution. Needless to say, he felt with hearty simplicity the heavy responsibility and gravity of such a judicial decision, and not unnaturally seems to have worried about it more than he commonly did over his work. He sought for guidance in more than usually prolonged prayer and intercession, and finally, with one of those few but striking bodily gestures that mark the turning point of his life, he threw down his thesis at the foot of the cross on the altar, and left it lying there, as if awaiting judgment. Then he turned and came down the altar steps and buried himself once more in prayer. But the other friars, it is said, were watching, and well they might be, for they declared afterwards that the figure of Christ had come down from the cross before their mortal eyes, and stood upon the scroll, saying, Thomas, thou hast written well concerning the sacrament of my body. It was after this vision that the incident is said to have happened, of his being borne up miraculously in mid-air. An acute observer said of St. Thomas in his own time, he could alone restore all philosophy if it had been burnt by fire. This is what is meant by saying that he was an original man, a creative mind, that he could have made his own cosmos out of stones and straws, even without the manuscripts of Aristotle or Augustine. But there is here not an uncommon confusion between the thing in which a man is most original and that in which he is most interested, or between the thing that he does best and the thing that he loves most. Because St. Thomas has a unique and striking philosopher, it is almost unavoidable that this book should be merely, or mainly, a sketch of his philosophy. It cannot be, and does not pretend to be, a sketch of his theology. But this is because the theology of a saint is simply the theism of a saint, or rather the theism of all saints. It is less individual, but it is much more intense. It is concerned with the common origin, but it is hardly an occasion for originality. Thus we are forced to think first of Thomas as the maker of Thomist philosophy, as we think first of Christopher Columbus and the discoverer of America, though he may have been quite sincere in his pious hope to convert the Khan of Tartary, or of James Watt as the discoverer of the steam engine, though he may have been a devout fire worshipper, or a sincere Scottish Calvinist, or all things of curious things. Anyhow, it is but natural that Augustine and Aquinas, Bonaventure and Duns Scotus, all the doctors and saints, should draw nearer to each other as they approach the divine units in things, that there should, in that sense, be less difference between them in theology than in philosophy. It is true that, in some manners, the critiques of Aquinas thought his philosophy had unduly affected his theology. This is especially so, touching the charge that he made the state of beatitude too intellectual, conceiving it as the satisfaction of the love of truth, rather than specifically as the truth of love. It is true that the mystics and the men of the Franciscan school dwelt more lovingly on the admitted supremacy of love, but it was mostly a matter of emphasis, perhaps tinged faintly by temperament, possibly, to suggest something which is easier to feel than to explain, in the case of St. Thomas, a shadowy influence of a sort of shyness. Whether the supreme ecstasy is more affectational than intellectual is no very deadly matter of quarrel among men who believe it is both, but do not profess even to imagine the actual experience of either. But I have a sort of feeling that, even if St. Thomas had thought it was emotional as St. Bonaventure did, he would never have been so emotional about it. It would always have embarrassed him to write about love at such length. The one exception permitted to him was the rare but remarkable output of his poetry. All sanctity is secrecy, and his sacred poetry was really like a secretion, like the pearl in a tightly closed oyster. He may have written more of it than we know, but part of it came into public use through the particular circumstance of being asked to compose the office for the feast of Corpus Christi, a festival first established after the controversy to which he had contributed in the scroll that he had laid on the altar. It does certainly reveal an entirely different side of his genius, and certainly it was genius. As a rule, he was an eminently practical prose writer. Some would say a very prosaic prose writer. He maintained controversy with an eye on only two qualities, clarity and courtesy. And he maintained these because they were entirely practical qualities, affecting the probabilities of conversion. But the composer of the Corpus Christi service was not merely what even the wild and woolly would call a poet. He was what the most fastidious would call an artist. His double function rather recalls the double activity of some great Renaissance craftsmen like Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, who would work on the outer wall, planning and building the fortifications of the city, and then retire into the inner chamber to carve or model some cup or casket for a reliquary. The Corpus Christi office is like some old musical instrument, quaintly and carefully inlaid with many colored stones and metals. The author had gathered remote texts about pasture and fruition like rare herbs. There is a notable lack of the loud and obvious in the harmony, and the whole is strung with two strong Latin lyrics. Father John O'Connor has translated them with an almost miraculous aptitude. But a good translator will be the first to agree that no translation is good, or at any rate, good enough. How are we to find 8 short English words which actually stand for summat unus summus mille, quantum isti, tantum ille? How is anyone really to render the sound of pangilingua when the very first symbol has a clang like the clash of cymbals? There was one other channel besides that of poetry, and it was that of private affectations, which this large and shy man could show he really as much caritas as St. Francis, certainly as much as any Franciscan theologian. Bonaventure was not likely to think that Thomas was lacking in the love of God, and certainly he was never lacking in the love of Bonaventure. He felt for his whole family a steady, we might say a stubborn tenderness. And considering how his family treated him, this would seem to call not only for charity, but for his characteristic virtue of patience. Towards the end of his life, he seems to have leaned especially on his love of one of the brethren, a friar named Reginald, who received from him some strange and rather startling confidences, of the kind that he very seldom gave even to his friends. It was to Reginald that he gave the last and rather extraordinary hint, which was the end of his controversial career, and practically of his earthly light, a hint that history has never been able to explain. He had returned victorious from his last combat with Sigurd of Brabant, returned and retired. His particular quarrel was the one point, as we may say, in which his outer and his inner life had crossed and coincided. He realized how he had longed from childhood to call up allies in the battle for Christ, how he had only long afterwards called up Aristotle as an ally, and now in that last nightmare of sophistry, he had for the first time truly realized that some might really wish Christ to go down before Aristotle. He never recovered from the shock. He won his battle because he was the best brain of his time, but he could not forget such an inversion of the whole idea and purpose of his life. He was the sort of man who hates hating people. He had not been used to hating even their hateful ideas beyond a certain point. But in the abyss of anarchy opened by Sigurd's sophistry of the double mind of man, he had seen the possibility of the perishing of all idea of religion, and even all idea of truth. Brief and fragmentary are the phrases that record it, We can gather that he came back with a sort of horror of that outer world, in which there blew such wild winds of doctrine, and a longing for the inner world which any Catholic can share, and in which the saint is not cut off from simple men. He resumed the strict routine of religion, and for some time said nothing to anybody. And then something happened, it is said while he was celebrating Mass, the nature of which will never be known among mortal men. His friend Reginald asked him to return also to his equally regular habits of reading and writing, and following the controversies of the hour. He said with a singular emphasis, "I can write no more." There seems to have been a silence, after which Reginald again ventured to approach the subject, and Thomas answered him with even greater vigor, "I can write no more. I have seen things which make all my writings like straw."